Hey guys, I want to talk today about the idea of humanity as being the child of alien races. So, in other words, view the relationship of humanity to other races as that of a parent to a child. With the alien races being the parent of humanity. I think with respect to some races, that's just a metaphor and it's a way of thinking about it. With respect to other races, that is quite literally true, because we are in fact an engineered race, and we're the creation of another race, and actually of many races. So there's been a lot of visitation, manipulation, experimentation here on this planet, and we're not the first race to use this planet as a home and as a learning environment. That when people hear, okay, we were created by another race, it can sound a little bit scary at first, and then you get into all of these ideas of humanity being created as a slave race. No, that's not true. All races are created by another. There is no other way for a race to come into being except for another, more advanced form of consciousness to create it. And if you go up far enough on the hierarchy of consciousness, you eventually get to the source consciousness, which is also creating, races, itself. So every race that we'll ever encounter was created by something else, by another race, another being, another form of consciousness, all the way up to the one source consciousness. So there's nothing bad about that. It's very, very normal. That's just the way things are. There is no randomness. Nothing is random. There is only consciousness. That's the only thing that exists, is the one source consciousness. So if everything is consciousness at its most fundamental level, how could anything be random? There's no possibility for randomness. It's just free will acting in various forms, and different types of matter will have different levels of free will, and all of that will create confusing and sometimes unexpected results. And so that definitely will happen, but it's not random because it's always the workings of consciousness. So if you look at the sources that I recommend, which is first of all my favorite, the Zeta interviews. I also recommend the raw material. You'll see that they refer a lot to many periods of visitation on this planet, and many races coming here for a long period of time, doing, who knows what. But there's been a lot going on. And then it appears that at some point, my suspicion, based on my understanding of things, is that, there's a planetary consciousness itself. That planetary consciousness is most likely, exploring all the possibilities of form itself in its own ways. And so it's constantly throwing up new species of animals, new forms. And so I suspect that at some point, basically, there were, different types of hominids. Some of those may have been, natural, quote unquote natural, which is not random evolution, but it's the planetary consciousness itself exploring all the possibilities of form. And those hominids were then manipulated by, various races. And so then you start to get all sorts of different types of hominids, with different levels of genetic manipulation, until finally there does look like there was at one point one hominid which showed a lot of promise, and a race came, did the final manipulation, which really gave us the intelligence that we have now. And that's what really created Homo sapiens. It's unclear when this happened, but I'd say we can just kind of guess, on the scale of maybe a couple 100,000 years, something like that. I don't know, 100,000, 200,000, 300,000. Who knows? It's really not that important. It doesn't really matter, because some races, especially ones that are more positively oriented, that's kind of what they do. They go around the galaxy, they go around the universe, and they spread life. And I can see why. I think that would be pretty cool. And if maybe, someday we advance enough, then, we can do that too. And they understand that when you provide a new physical form, a new physical race that provides the opportunity for pure consciousness, or, some level of consciousness that's at some level in the hierarchy from source down, to then enter, to then use that physical race as a vehicle for experience, as a vehicle for growth, and that allows that race and then all the individuals of that race to, individuate further and to provide themselves definition. So this is just part of the process of the one infinite creator, the source consciousness, fragmenting itself into infinite facets and giving itself infinite perspectives. And it's exploring infinite possibilities. And it does this through all these different levels of consciousness that has split off from itself. Some of those levels of consciousness are, really, really high. Let's say like, a higher level of consciousness. What does that mean? The state of consciousness, I think you should just view it as just the mostly the potential for unconditional love. Because the closer you are to source consciousness, the closer you are to realizing the unity of everything and realizing that everything is one, which is essentially the realization of love. And then unconditional love will come naturally because you realize that everything is a facet of the creator. So even, let's say, the Zeta themselves or other races that you may come across, they're very, very highly advanced. Well, they also were created by another race. They didn't just pop out of nowhere either. So everyone, every race, every individual is created by another, and now that gives you the opportunity to go through your own experiences as an individual, as a member of a collective, as a member of a race, and provide more and more individuation, more and more definition for yourself. So that's kind of the general process of evolution that we're going through, the real evolution, not random evolution of molecules bouncing into each other, and then they accidentally bounce into each other so much that, life develops, and then molecules keep bouncing into each other accidentally in your brain, and that creates thoughts. That's not how it works. There's no randomness. There's no random evolution. There's consciousness operating at many, many different layers and operating through many different ways and exploring the possibilities of experience. So even, this is kind of, you can see this, in the raw material, they discuss this, even when you see something like a solar system or a galaxy, that didn't just pop out of nowhere either. That's not random. That's a different level of consciousness creating, the universe, creating a galaxy, creating a solar system as the, like the playground for it to then enter later. So it's creating for itself an environment where it can then continue to fragment itself, enter into that environment, and go through a series of experiences. And if you are, in your very nature, infinite consciousness, this is a way of doing, this would be very, very interesting. What does it matter to you if you're a really high level of consciousness, let's say, and you're pretty close to source consciousness, and hey, if I fragment myself over and over and over, and I spend, billions of years, trillions of years, whatever it is, what does that matter to you? You're infinite. This is basically what you do. And this is what we're doing. And this is what we're experiencing now. So from that standpoint, the idea of, the parent to the child, in other words, humanity as the children of these other races, is literally true with some of the races. Some of the races had nothing to do with our creation. They come by and they see what's going on. They say, oh, this is cool. Who knows what they've been seeing. They've been in, traveling the infinite universes and infinite dimensions and seeing all sorts of crazy stuff. And then they happen to come across, a physical planet, and they see us and they say, oh, it's interesting. Look what these guys are doing. Pretty cool. But some races, and it appears to be, these are the races that are more in our galactic neighborhood. So they're not that far off. They're not that far away from us. They resemble us in many ways. They're also humanoid. Makes sense. We're descended from them. And also it would make sense as to why all the planets in this neighborhood, let's say this galactic neighborhood, might all be experimenting with a humanoid form because there's a higher level of consciousness. We would perceive that as something non-physical, a greater power, an interdimensional super consciousness of some kind. But that's just, different levels of the hierarchy. And we have to remember that there really is, in reality, no separation at all. There is no separation. Everything is the source consciousness. But from our viewpoint, it helps, it's actually impossible for us not to classify things and to put things into certain categories. It's just the way our minds work. So we might see the level, the conscious being that operates at the level of a galaxy, let's say, as, okay, we've got to name it. We've got to call it something. We've got to give it some sort of, classification. And, that I'm sure that happens and people might have different names for it, but it's all this cascading hierarchy of consciousness, fragmenting itself, splitting itself into infinite threads, which then split into more threads, which then split into more threads, and those threads can intertwine and they can interact in very complicated ways, and information and experience goes up and down the hierarchy. And so the farther away you are from the source consciousness, then that just means you can have different types of experience because you don't remember who you are and you don't know your true nature. And that's not a bad thing. That enables the types of experience that we're having now, which are very interesting and special. It's very, bittersweet is the way I like to, is what it feels like to me. But, I recognize if I actually had constant contact with my higher self or with a higher form of consciousness, I might not take everything around me so seriously. And maybe that's good or bad, but then I wouldn't have this experience. This experience wouldn't be a true experience. So in order for what I'm living through now, which is, it's good and bad, and there's great things that happen, and there's stress, and there's fear, and there's joy. In order for that to be real, I have to take it as real and I have to take it very, very seriously. So I have to enter the illusion myself. And while I'm inside the illusion, I have to not see the illusion. If I see the illusion, it ruins the experience. At some point, you will see the illusion. It's just natural. It's a natural part of your development. And you will pierce the veil. That just means that, maybe you've kind of maxed out this type of experience and you're ready for another type of experience. I think many people on the planet are reaching that stage now. This is part of the development that we're starting to see of the collective consciousness of the race. When there's enough of a critical mass of a race that starts to realize, maybe you've had enough incarnations yourself, and many other people have had as well, and you start to realize, hey, there's more than just being born on this planet and going back to the spirit realm and coming back and reincarnating and recycling, as the Zeta call it, the recycled process. There's a point at which that it is no longer useful to you. You've done it enough. You're ready for something different. You're ready for something more. I think that we are, as a race, approaching that point. And I think that's what we're going to see this century. And we're going to see the opening shots of that in a very dramatic way in the next 20 years or so, I would guess. And that's going to be the AI singularity, and then the telepathic technology that we're going to develop, the biological, organic telepathic technology, which is going to support us. There's going to be a lot of dangers, but it's going to be, I think, a really interesting process. So if you think about that, if you think about, okay, this is, at least one type of evolution of consciousness that's pretty standard. Who knows what else is out there? Who knows, like some interdimensional race that's in some sort of, some different type of reality that we wouldn't even perceive as physical. Who knows what spiritual evolution looks like to them? It'll be interesting someday to find out. But for us, a physical race, humanoid, okay, this is pretty standard, or at least one, pretty, I'm sure pretty common path. And so then you take a step back, you say, okay, so how do the other races perceive us? And how do these, the benevolently oriented races, the positive races, how do they see us? Well, they view us as children. In some cases, because we, in a sense, really are their children. In other cases, because we behave like children. So they understand that we're at a stage of our development where we still have a lot to learn. We're growing, but we're going through that awkward phase, of childhood where you have great potential for good and also great potential for destruction. And so that is what the human race is going through right now. And these other races see that we can become also an advanced benevolent race, but we are also very destructive, and we also have a lot of negative tendencies that we need to grow out of. So it's a very difficult situation for another benevolent race because they respect free will. So they're not going to come in and just impose themselves on us, because they respect free will, above all else. And also it defeats the purpose of us going through this learning process. They will not interfere in the learning process of others because they know that we have to grow and we have to do it ourselves. They don't want to be our caretakers. They don't want to come in here and rule us forever. Why? The ones that created us, if they have to sit here and babysit us, then who's a slave to who? Then they would be a slave to their own creation. That's not the point. The point is for them to create something that can grow and then eventually stand on its own. And so that's what they're trying to do with us. They're trying to get us to learn to stand on our own, grow up, essentially, move past this violent phase, start to understand the greater reality, the true nature of reality, the process of spiritual evolution at the individual level and at the level of the entire race. Get used to dealing with other races. We have to learn how to deal with negative races because they're out there. I think when you think about negative races, if you think about the child-parent metaphor, I think it's very useful as well, because if you're a parent and your child comes to you and says, there's a bully at school, you don't just go and deal with the bully yourself necessarily, unless it's really, really dangerous. Maybe it's very, very dangerous. Maybe you do need to step in. But mostly you're going to support your child. You're going to say, okay, listen, here's how you deal with a bully. Here's what you do. You got to stand up to them. You got to learn how to deal with bullies. Well, that's the stage that we're at as well. We need to learn how to deal with bullies. So there's negative races out there, which are essentially like bullies to us. It's part of our growth process. So a positive race isn't going to come in here and take care of the situation for us and solve the problem. They're going to help us, support us, and hopefully teach us enough in various ways so that we can stand on our own. So, that's why there's so much guidance that's happening right now. Different people having different levels of inspiration, contact, but it's very complicated and messy because of the nature of the human race at this point, and the nature of each person, that when you're physically incarnate and you pass behind the veil of forgetting, and then you are filtering everything through a human mind, you're going to have a very certain outlook on things. And if you see an alien, there has been, open visitation, visitation in the past. It's open contact in the past physically, it appears. But the problem is that humanity in the past has shown typically two ways of reacting to that. Number one, they respond in fear, which is not good, especially if you view your state of consciousness, if you see like what the Zetas say, for example, that your state of consciousness is simply the level of unconditional love that you're able to express. That's roughly speaking, that's kind of what the state of consciousness is. So if that's what you're trying to help grow, is help someone grow in their ability to love, causing fear in them is not going to help, and that's probably going to be counterproductive. You don't want fear to exist or to occur in the person you're trying to help, because that's going to stop the process of understanding and growing in the dimension of unconditional love. So in the past, when there's been visitation, humans either react in fear, which is bad, or they react by worshiping. They worship these ETs, these other civilizations as gods, and they also don't want that. Because from that, again, they don't want to sit here and be our caretakers and rule over us. Imagine from their perspective, they have way more interesting things to do. I mean, it's an infinite creation. I mean, how many things are out there in the galaxy, in the universe, in other universes, in other dimensions? You think they want to sit here, I don't know, sitting in some temple, like bossing us around and telling us to go, mine gold or something like that? They don't want that. They've got way better things to do. So when they see us react either with fear or with worshiping them as gods, okay, that just means we're not ready. They leave us alone. Let's give these guys a couple thousand years. We'll come back later and we'll see how they're doing. Now it appears we're reaching that stage where we're getting ready, and there's a lot of us that are ready. There's still a lot of us that aren't, but at some point it's like you just got to bite the bullet. And I think that's what we're going through right now. So if you look back over the last, let's just say the last 80 years, let's say since World War II, we developed nuclear technology. Obviously, it's very, very dangerous, very risky. There are benefits to it. You have nuclear energy, which can be used for good, and we are using it for some good. But there's a lot of dangers. Everyone knows what nuclear weapons are. So the races get a little bit nervous when they see that now we have the ability to blow ourselves up. That could be an issue. So, how do they respond? Well, they start with a program of slowly acclimating us to the possibility of other life in the galaxy, other life in the universe. And they need to do that very smoothly, very gently, so as to not cause a panic and not cause fear. And they want us to investigate ourselves to develop curiosity because they don't want to infringe on our free will. So they don't want to just land, in front of the TV cameras and say, "Hey guys, here we are. Here's what's going to happen next. You guys do this, this, and this," and then they're going to start bossing us around. They don't want that either. So they're playing a very fine balance between supporting us, guiding us, helping us to expand our awareness. But they can't just sit back and do nothing necessarily, because now we have nuclear technology, and then the Lord only knows what else. So we're in real danger, and we have a real possibility of destroying ourselves. So they have to play that balancing game between helping us, alerting us to the awareness, to the reality of other life, but not infringing on our free will, and doing it in a way that doesn't cause fear. So that is why you see so much of the UFO phenomenon as being something which inherently can always be doubted. They will always leave you with plausible deniability. So if you see something, even if you see something and you are not ready for it and you don't want to accept it, you will explain it away. And they will make sure that it's in a way that can be explained away by you. You can just say, "No, I was hallucinating. No, it was just a dream. No, that didn't really happen." You just forget it. You just put it out of your mind. And that's because it's up to you as an individual to say, "No, you know what? I think there's something there. I've got to start looking into it. I've got to start investigating it." And then once you do, you can start to have more and more realizations. But they're not going to force it on you, at least the positive races. Now, there are negative races, as we've discussed. The negative races, their defining characteristic is they couldn't care less about your free will. So they might come in and do rough things, and you might still be in confusion, because it's just so shocking to you. But there is a possibility that they will do, terrible things. The Zeta describe that there are, basically two factions of the race. There are what they call themselves, we call them the Zeta. And they are positively oriented, but there is a faction of the race, the one that we call the abductors, who are kind of the stereotypical grays that you hear about. And that's another faction of the race that's split off from the main, Zeta collective consciousness. It's not clear why. And they're negatively oriented. So that type of race, they'll come in and, they'll have their way with you if they want, because they don't have the same respect for spiritual evolution or free will that the positively oriented races. But, that's part of our growing process. That's what we have to learn to deal with ourselves. So then this whole process of awakening a race to the possibilities that are out there becomes very, very messy and very, very tricky and very, very confusing, because you have positive races, negative races. You have positive groups within humanity, negative groups within humanity. Each of those groups interacting with each other in very complex ways. People that maybe they start off positive and then they go negative, or maybe it's the other way around. You have, maybe groups of people with good intentions. So, for example, during the Cold War, you can understand why some parts of the American government would say, "We're in a Cold War with the Soviets. Look, here's a potential technology that could help us win it. Okay, we've got to keep it secret. We've got to cover it up." And then that would, over time, lead to this, enormous cover-up in part. You could also imagine groups of people maybe starting to work with another race, and maybe some of those are part of the government or part of some element of the government. Maybe they knew they were working with a negative race. Maybe not, because there's a lot of manipulation and deception. Maybe by the time they realize that they've been deceived, well, now you got a problem. Now you've got a real big problem. You've been working with a negative race. You realize you've been deceived, but what are you going to do about it? Are you just going to come out on TV and say, "Hey guys, guess what? Aliens are real, and some of them are nasty, and unfortunately, we gave them permission to abduct people. My bad. Sorry about that, guys. No harm, no foul." Well, they're not going to admit to that. So the possibilities of what's happening right now, we're definitely in the fog of war, in a sense. There's a lot of confusion, and there's a lot of, cross purposes, mixed purposes, very complex interactions from our standpoint, but also from the standpoint of the races. I mean, they're seeing, we are children in a sense, but also we're not dumb, and we have free will. And so we're doing a lot of things that are problematic. And so part of what the positive races are trying to do is, as they, support us in the same way they would support a child. They want us to grow properly. They have to make sure that we don't destroy ourselves. So they're, trying to avoid that. But they also know that we have the potential, like I said, for a lot of good and for a lot of destruction if they don't guide us a little bit. What if we turn out to be, what if we keep advancing technologically, but we don't advance spiritually? Then we could be a really big problem for a lot of the other races. Now all of a sudden they're faced with a new neighbor that are a bunch of lunatics and now armed with, maybe pretty decent weapons. Yeah, we're not going to go conquer them or destroy them, but we could be a problem. So they view this also in a very practical sense of, we've got to make sure that this race grows properly because it could go well and it could go poorly, and they're trying to help make sure that it goes well, for our sake and for their sake, and then also because all that fits into this greater process of spiritual evolution and of facets of the source consciousness splitting off, individuating, learning, and gaining experience. So I think what all of this is heading to, and you can see this in the raw material, they discuss the next phase of a society like ours as being the formation of the social memory complex. The Zetas call it the collective consciousness. It's essentially, that's the same thing. It's a stage in the evolution of a race where the individuals of that race are able to freely join this collective consciousness, and they will be connected with each other, through essentially telepathy. They will be connected to the collective consciousness, which is its own kind of like a super consciousness. It's a consciousness that encompasses the whole race, at least of the members that want to join it, and you don't have to join it. And so a race can split. That's what happened with the Zeta. The one faction of the race split off and became negatively oriented. And that's, I think, is probably, very likely to happen among us as well. That's something that we have to be ready for. Not every person on the planet has a positive orientation. And that's, a perfectly fine way to go through the infinite creation to explore. If you're attracted to the dark, then that's just your bias. It's not inherently wrong. And the infinite creator allows you freedom. And so it's up to you. But I think that we are going to see the formation, at least the early stages of the formation of the collective consciousness. I think it's going to happen quickly from here. I think the technology that we're developing, first with AI and then with biological AI, I think that those are key steps in this process. And I think that the reason that we're going through that is because this is part of the support and guidance that we're receiving as a race. I think that some of the positive races have seen that, okay, how do we help this race to develop? The main issue we have is not technology. In other words, they're not going to come here and say, hey guys, guess what? Here's free energy. Here's energy technology. We already have that, I think. And I think it's being suppressed. And once they see that, it's like, okay, these guys are a bunch of maniacs. You can't just come in and give them technology. Or maybe we stole it. Who knows how we got it? But so they can't just come in and say, check it out. Free energy, blah, blah, blah. Now you guys can make anything. That doesn't do us any good because they know that we can just use that for weapons. That just increases our probability of destroying ourselves. What they need to do, and I think what they're trying to do, is get us to learn how to connect with each other and how to realize that every human is part of one entity. And we're all descended from the same oversoul, the human oversoul. And we're all part of that same process. But we need to really feel that and experience that directly in a very direct way. It can't just be theoretical knowledge. It can't just be religious knowledge or philosophical knowledge. It has to be real and direct. And to do that, we basically have to learn to connect to each other telepathically and with higher states of consciousness. Those are the things that we're going to be developing in the future, in the very, very near future. The advanced races, their technology is all based around consciousness. It's all different ways of affecting consciousness or supporting their own consciousness. And there are actual technological things you can do with that, real machines and things like that, or devices. That's where they focus a lot of their effort. And that's, I think, what we're going to start doing very soon. And that's just part of this natural process of evolution. And I think as we go through that, it's going to change the nature of being human. It's going to change human nature in a way that helps us to actually start to be kind and compassionate with each other, because that is what's required for us to become an advanced race. It's not technology. It's not the super warp fusion drive 2000. It's not some propulsion technology or free energy. None of that matters. The defining characteristic of a more advanced race is its state of consciousness. In other words, its ability to express unconditional love. So you could have a very, very advanced race with absolutely primitive technology, because the technology does not matter. You could just be sitting on the surface of your planet with living completely naturally, no spaceships, no spacecraft. What's the point? It doesn't matter. If you've reached those higher levels of consciousness and unconditional love, you can do a lot with that. So that is the true advancements that we need to make. Everything that we're seeing now in terms of technological development, it's a bit of a sideshow. It doesn't really matter. Yeah, because of our nature, the way that we are, the way that we've developed. Okay, we're in it. It's going to be pretty cool, I think. I love technology, so it's going to be, it's going to be interesting. There's going to be a lot of dangers, but it just happens to be the way that we've developed. I'm sure. I would bet $1 million that there are races out there that have reached extremely high levels with what we would consider to be primitive technology, because it doesn't really matter. And there's many ways to explore the infinite creation. So I think the UFO phenomena makes a lot more sense when you understand that the goal of the positive races is our spiritual evolution, not our technological evolution. That's why they don't land, openly for the whole planet. Maybe for individuals that are ready, there's a lot of contact on an individual level or a small group level as they slowly start to wake up more and more of humanity. But they're not just going to come in here and give us a bunch of cool stuff, a bunch of cool toys, when we already have toys that are more dangerous than we can handle already, with what we've developed, in the last 80 years. But what they do want to help us with is to develop this ability to connect to each other in consciousness. That is what we're going to see now. And that's going to be the real advancement and the real evolution. It's the development of consciousness, of connecting to each other via telepathic means, of each person starting to understand that they can also, in consciousness, explore different dimensions, have different levels of contact, communicate with people with spirits who are not incarnate, communicate with other physical races, other interdimensional races in consciousness. So we will have open physical contact at some point. I don't think it's going to be too far out. It could be years, could be decades. I think it's probably going to be this century. But before we do, I think what we're going to start seeing is a lot of people having a lot of contact in consciousness. It's happening now, just at a level that you probably don't remember, because most of it's happening in your dream states, in the astral, and things like that. And then when you awaken, and you assume your local consciousness, and you're the local construct, you don't remember any of that. I think that's going to start coming to the fore. And once people start having contact, first in consciousness, then we're going to be ready for contact physically. And that's what the races are trying to guide us to, without us blowing ourselves up first. So that's a big question. Will we blow ourselves up or not? Let's see. I'm optimistic, but you never know. And I'm sure it's happened. I'm sure that this thing that we're going through, where, whoops, these guys didn't make it. They blew themselves up. If we do it, we won't be the first. And actually, it's probably not even the first time that we've done it. So that's kind of an interesting thing to think about. We're not the first human civilization. We're not the first civilization in general on this planet. We're not the first human civilization either. Things have gone wrong before. So we need to take it seriously and really try to develop properly, because, it can still go wrong. But, fingers crossed. I think we've got some good momentum this time. So let's just, I think we're ready. Let's move on. Let's go on to something, bigger and better. So let's hope it works. All right, guys, if you have any questions, just drop down below. Thanks.